they can find the same exons that you find in the TPA gene within other genes. And so they think essentially that this TPA gene was created by exon shuffling, aided by transposable elements that essentially piece together a new gene from the exons of already existing genes. All right, well, so next time you get up in the morning, look at yourself in the mirror and say, thank you, transposable elements. You made me what I am today. Okay, well, the last topic we're going to cover in this class is evolution. And a lot of this lecture on evolution is sort of different in character than the other topics that we've covered this semester. Mostly, this class is essentially about cellular biology. But the evolutionary chapter, talks more about species than the biology of species rather than individual cells. Where did I put my overheads for evolution? I just feel very disorganized today for some reason. Here we go. I think some of the background here on evolution you might have gotten in other courses. At least I hope in other biology courses they covered some evolutionary topics. Some of this may be familiar to you, but it doesn't hurt to see it more than once. The basic, if I had to summarize evolution into just a few words, it would be this: that it was invented in the mid-1800s, or discovered in the mid-1800s by this man, Charles Darwin, and he was an Englishman. And the basic idea he proposed is that the species we have on Earth evolved from different species in the past. Like you see at the bottom of the diagram, some sort of bird species there, and that bird species through evolution became not only different species, but more than one species. And that was a radical idea when he proposed it. Before the time of Darwin, they believed that the Earth was very young, only about 6,000 years old, which, although 6,000 years seems like a long time, it's a relatively young, that would be too short amount of time for species to evolve by the mechanism that Darwin proposed. And we now know the Earth to be a lot older than that, in the billions of years. And before Darwin's time, people did not believe that species evolved. They thought the species we have on Earth had always been there and would always been there. It would always be there. But as I said, Darwin came along and said, no, the life forms do evolve, species do evolve. Before Darwin came along, there were a couple of scientists that influenced him, and one of these was a man named Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, not a biologist. But some of Lyell's ideas about slow gradual change were very seminal for Darwin to come up with his theory of evolution. There's Charles Lyell, and he disagreed with the young Earth hypothesis. He thought the Earth was very, very old. As it turns out, he didn't get the number right. He thought it was hundreds of millions of years old, which is obviously a lot more than 6,000, but still not as old as we think it is today. But his real insight was that if you look at the geological features of the Earth today, he said you can get evidence by looking at those features that the Earth is very, very old, much older than 6,000 years. And he also said if you look at these geological features that we have, got there because of millions of years of slow gradual change, but you can still see that slow process going on today. I think sometimes you hear the phrase, or Lyell's phrase was, the present is the key to the past. The geological activities going on Earth today have been going on for millions of years, and that's how you explain the features we have today. And Charles Lyell was also an Englishman, and so I'm sure he was looking at geological features mostly over in Europe, but we can look at some features here in the United States and see what he was talking about. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon, and the Colorado River formed the Grand Canyon, by slowly carving out the rock formations there in Colorado and Arizona. And when they study the Grand Canyon today, they can see that every year the Colorado River cuts about 1 centimeter, about half an inch of rock as it's flowing through the rock there. And if you do the math, 6,000 years is much too short a time to explain the current depth of the Grand Canyon, which in some regions is over 1 mile deep. And so that's the type of thing that this Lyle fellow was talking about. He said that this process, the erosion that we see going on today, explains the feature we have today, but that 6,000 years is not enough. You would need millions and millions of years to get this sort of the Grand Canyon. And here's another example. If you look at a map of the world and you look at the shape of South America and compare it to the shape of Africa just off to the east there, you can see it almost looks like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fitting together. And map makers had noticed this for a long time. And so they wondered if at some point in the past they had been, Africa and South America had been joined into one continent. And well, we now know that to be true. If you look at some very ancient fossils on the east coast of South America, you find some of those same fossil species on the west coast of Africa. So certainly they were joined for a long time at some point in the distant past. And not only that, if you look at the Atlantic Ocean between them, there is what's called a fault, a split in the Earth's crust there, where the two continental plates are being moved apart by the action of the lava underneath like this. And so we can see today that Africa and South America are still heading apart from each other, but it's a very, very slow process. I think, if I remember right, it was on the order of just an inch or two a year is all they're moving apart from each other. 6,000 years is much too short a time to explain the current distance of thousands of miles that they are apart from each other. So again, the idea of slow gradual change can end up giving you big change if you give it millions and millions of years, was Lyell's contribution to geology. And essentially, Darwin ended up applying that same concept, but to species changing, living things changing, instead of just features of the Earth. Another scientist that influenced Darwin was this man, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was a French biologist, and he came up with the idea of species evolving into new species before Darwin did. And we always associate Darwin with the idea of discovering evolution, and Darwin discovered the method of evolution, but other people had before him come up with the idea that species evolve. The reason why we don't give Lamarck credit for discovering evolution is he got the mechanism wrong. His idea of how evolution worked was something called inheritance of acquired characteristics, which he thought if something physically happened to your body in your life, you would pass that trait on to your offspring. And the way they often illustrate this is with giraffe necks. I don't know how the giraffe got picked, but anyway, if you look at giraffes today, one of their most noticeable features is they have these extremely long necks. And I remember reading somewhere that they don't actually have any extra vertebrae in their necks compared to comparable species, but the vertebrae that they do have are just elongated compared to other similar plant-eating species. Anyway, so Lamarck's explanation, this inheritance of acquired characteristics, was this, that the giraffes at some time in the distant past had short necks, and it became important for them to reach up, I guess, to feed on leaves from trees, and so they were constantly stretching their necks higher and higher and higher to try to get those leaves. And if you stretch a body part, the proteins and the bones in that body part can get a little bit longer. And so he thought that this acquired characteristic, stretching their neck muscles, they passed on to their offspring. And so their offspring had a little bit longer necks, and furthermore stretched those long necks even further. And so they passed that acquired trait on to their offspring, and eventually, through generation after generation, the necks got longer and longer and longer. The problem with that is it just doesn't make biological sense. It just can't be true from the way we understand inheritance to work. You can definitely modify a body part throughout your lifetime, even human beings can stretch their necks out if you work at it. These people here put rings to stretch their necks out. It's considered a beauty trait. And so the muscles and bones there in the neck are getting stretched out, but that doesn't mean she's going to have a long-necked kid, because the only thing you pass on to your kid are the genes in your egg and your sperm, which are down here. And doing something to your neck muscles up here just is not going to affect the DNA down there in your gonads. It just there's just no connection between the two. Or to use maybe another example, if you had some sort of accident and lost a finger from your hand, it doesn't mean your kids are going to be born without a finger, because that's the muscle and bone there, and it just doesn't affect the DNA down in your gonads. And so Lamarck was right on the species evolved, but he just didn't understand the way genetics worked, so he just doesn't get credit for discovering evolution. Okay, so in the early 1820s, Charles Darwin was selected to be the biologist on a voyage of exploration that was being done by the British Navy. They had a sailing vessel called the HMS Beagle, and in 1831 it set sail from England to South America. See the British Isles up there in the kind of the top middle, and then they sailed downward towards what's current present-day Brazil. And what the British Navy was trying to do was just basically improve their maps. They wanted better maps of the Americas, and so the ship was just going to sort of work its way along the coast of South America, exploring and mapping. But they wanted someone also to take notes of what sort of plants and animals they found there. And Darwin, I think he was 22 when he was selected to be the naturalist. And so he took careful notes of all the plants and animals that they discovered along the way. And if you look at the left-hand side, there's the Galapagos Islands there. Those islands are about 500 miles out in the Pacific Ocean from what's today the current country of Ecuador. And I think Ecuador still owns those islands. So they're considered part of Ecuador. Here's a little bit closer image, and a closer image still. It's a archipelago. I'm not sure exactly how many islands there are, but obviously several. They are volcanic islands, and they're very barren, almost deserty. I think the next picture shows some of them there. There's not too much vegetation. And there's some interesting species there. There are penguins there, which seems a little bizarre because we normally think of penguins as being for cold environments. But even though it's on the equator, you do find penguins there. There's some iguanas there. What else? Well, I guess what's most pertinent here are some bird species. When Darwin was visiting the Galapagos, he found some finch birds there, living there, and he in fact found 14 different species of these finches. And that really got him thinking about, here's some of these species found in the Galapagos. That really got him thinking about where species come from, because he had a hard time explaining how you can get 14 different species of these finches on the Galapagos. And for animal species that you find on islands, generally they assume that they came from the mainland. And so the idea that you might get some finches from the mainland out on the islands is not that big a stretch of the imagination. But how you can get 14 different species to come over there did seem unlikely, because these finches are not migratory birds. They wouldn't voluntarily just fly 500 miles out to sea from the mainland to the islands. It's a pretty long reach from there, from one to the other. And so what biologists assume is that storms every now and then will transport island species from the mainland to an island. If you can imagine different species of finches out there in Ecuador just kind of flying around, and then imagine one day this really huge storm comes along and sucks up a few of these finches from the mainland and carries them out to sea hundreds of miles. Well, they would probably fly around looking for a place to land, and just settle on the first islands they came across. So, you know, that would be believable if there were just 1 or 2 species on the Galapagos, but 14 just didn't make sense. And so what Darwin decided was that probably just 1 species had come over from the mainland originally, and somehow it evolved into these 14 different species. And so that really got him thinking that you know, evolution, 1 species changing another, has to be a fact, but he didn't believe in Lamarck's explanation, and so he began to think of his own explanation. And we'll come back to this on Wednesday, but basically he fused together ideas from Lamarck and Lyell and his own ideas, and eventually came up with natural selection as the mechanism.